Hi folks, welcome to the weekend. I trust that you've had a good reading week. And on the subject of that, what have I been reading? Quite a bit, it turns out. I finished The Promise of the Child by Tom Toner. This is either a work of absolute genius or properly batshit crazy or possibly a piquant blend of the two. I'm actually not entirely sure where to begin in describing what I thought of this book. It's densely written in a good way. I think there's almost zero exposition. There's no pages of explaining references or the history or anything. There's zero hand-holding. It therefore demands careful reading. And it did take me quite a while to make my way through it. You know, building a picture as I went, gradually accumulating really half an idea what the fuck was going on by the end. Last week I said that I might well yank book 2 forward and plough straight on, but in the end I decided that I needed to let this one brew for a little while to settle in my mind, as it were. So in The Promise of the Child, we're 12,500 years in the future, and essentially the world is unrecognisable. 12,500 years, after all, is a long time. It's longer than recorded history as we sit here in 2025. Weirdly, for a book that purports to be a space opera, it opens in 14th, is it, or 13th century Prague, and we're introduced to a character, Aaron, who reappears later on. Yes, 13,000 odd years later. Immortality, it turns out, has been around for quite a while. The Amarantine are the longest lived branch of humanity, effectively immortal, and strange things happen to the human body over that period of time, including developing a number of capabilities, among them instantaneous interstellar teleportation. Humanity has either evolved or has been re-engineered, refracted into subspecies, into what's known as the prism collectively. There are a bewildering number of these subspecies. Some are loping giants like the Melius, and some are knee-high bitey creatures, and all points in between. Oh, and to add to the mix, there are intelligent birds. Of course there are. I can imagine on receipt of the manuscript, Tom Toner's publisher going, look mate, this is really fucking impossible to understand. Let's put a glossary in the back, give them half a chance. And I, for one, was very grateful for that conversation. I was a frequent referrer to the glossary in the back. What is this word, I wondered? Is it an individual? Is it a species? Is it a place? Is it a spaceship? I've no idea. The glossary, it was very helpful, and I did have its place marked with my thumb for most of the time. So, all right, what's it about? Well, the prism, those re-engineered, maybe humans, or some of them at least, have had enough of being bossed about by the Amarantine, the immortals of the piece. The Amarantine are ruled by the oldest Amarantine, with the downside that extreme old age usually results in insanity of one form or another, and there's a delicate balance between being too insane to rule and being the oldest person to rule. The Amarantine are squabbling, therefore, over who should take over. Much of the action is based on a much changed Earth, but there's also enormous space habitats, seemingly hollowed out moons, and Amarantine prefectures in several solar systems. As befits a good space opera, it's a broad canvas, but Toner doesn't paint in broad strokes. It's finely detailed, almost like pointillist work. I must say, in my humble opinion, that The Promise of the Child, and presumably the other books in the trilogy as well, are not for the faint-hearted. The prose is excellent. I thought that Tom Toner is a good writer, I think, as far as I'm able to judge. Better and more literary than your typical space opera fare, for certain. But it is opaque. The pace is often slow, lugubrious, and doesn't really pick up until the final few chapters in the first book, where the seemingly unconnected plot threads begin to converge, sort of. So I think if you delight in world building, if you enjoy unravelling a complex plot, and if you like a sense of wonder of the completely different in your science fiction reading, then this might well work for you. I don't even know what to compare it to. Delaney, maybe? Book of the New Sun? Sort of. June in some respects even, but June is straightforward in comparison to this. I think it might just be unlike anything that I've ever read before. I admired it. I found it hard work to read, but rewarding. I don't know if I would say it's enjoyable or fun. It might be type 2 fun, perhaps. Fun in retrospect. I'm glad that I read it. I'm glad that I stuck with it, and I will definitely be reading The Weight of the World soon, the second book. It was a real handful, but a worthwhile one, I think. Next, on audiobook, I finished Those Once Forgotten, which is the second book of Nick Scrimgeour's Waystation trilogy. And this one picks up right where book 1 left off. The characters we met in Those Left Behind, the first book, have been scattered. They're picking up a cast of secondary characters along the way, in each thread fulfilling a different plot necessity. There's actually a large cast of characters, and I continue to enjoy the world that Scrimgeour has built. We get a little bit more insight here into what built the Waystations in the first place and the threat that they present. We also get more hints that this is merely the latest in a cycle of such threats over a period of millennia, and we even get to meet some living evidence of that. There are space pirates, black marketeers, mercenaries, double-crossing thieves, self-centered politicians, flawed and cynical soldiers to be redeemed at some point in the future, we assume. And as I said last week, there are several different alien species all forming part of the so-called coalition. But there are also the Idran, the apparent baddies of the piece, who, wouldn't you know it, aren't so very different after all. Can the warring enemies unite to face a common existential threat? Where Tom Toner's space opera is opaque and dense and difficult to hold in your head, these books are light in comparison from a plot perspective, although dark and frequently violent in places. They're predictable, one might even say formulaic space opera, and that's actually okay in my book. I'm listening to them on audiobook and they're not hard to follow whilst part of my brain is busy running, trying not to fall over. If we think of Tom Toner's books as a 7-course meal in a 3-star Michelin restaurant, beautifully presented, not always recognisable, exquisitely flavoured, then Scrimgeour's books are more like a burger and chips from your local sit-down restaurant chain. And there's a place for that. I like a good burger and chips from time to time. So I'm enjoying it. The characters are good. I'm enjoying the different alien species, and the interactions and the relationships between them are good. I'm investing in some of those relationships panning out the right way. Time will tell. And I want to know how it turns out. I'm about 40%, I think, into book 3 now. So more on that one next week. Next, I finished Hegira by Greg Bear, and this is the book that I picked up after my Tonathon at just over 200 pages. It's an old school quick read, and I went in knowing almost nothing about it. We're immediately introduced to the 3 characters who we follow during the book. They're on a quest, an old school quest. One is a soldier, a veteran of a long march, killer of hundreds, and one is his manservant, who's later freed, and one a penitent ex-scholar who's seeking his woman who's vanished or been transported or died or something. We're not entirely sure what to start with. It quickly becomes apparent that Hegira, the planet that we're on, is enormous, gas giant, enormous. Spaced at regular intervals are enormous columns or obelisks, which are hundreds of kilometres tall and covered in closely packed glyphs, the sum total of human knowledge. And among the competing factions on the planet, there's a race to get further up the obelisks. The knowledge gets more advanced the higher up you go. It seems that so far nobody's got higher than 1 or 2 kilometres up and by balloon, so that much knowledge of the so-called firstborn remains a mystery. What are these obelisks? Who put them there? And why are there no stars, or a sun for that matter? And how is Hegira so large without having bone-crushing gravity? Hegira is a strange mix. It's part standard issue fantasy quest to begin with a trio of mismatched characters on a journey, but as we progress, more and more science fiction elements are revealed. It's part big dumb object trek akin to Ringworld or Orbitsville, perhaps, part benevolent alien intervention in the style of Childhood Zen, sort of. There's a lot going on. It feels like Greg Bear threw a lot against the wall to see what would stick. I like the characters. I like the flip, the change in focus from the hero type to the nerdy ex-scholar, who it becomes apparent is the more important of the two. So I like the characters, but I didn't care that much about them. I've read quite a few of Greg Bear's books over the years, and this is a bit of an outlier, I think. I think it was the first one that he got published, and it's quite different to the rest. It reminded me a little bit at times of a Robert Silverberg, which is quite a comparison to make. And I enjoyed learning more about Hegira, why it's there, and the true purpose of the quest. So in general, I liked it. I didn't love it. It was good to decompress after The Promise of the Child, the Tom Toner book. It was completely different, and I appreciated it for that. Next, I finished, or devoured really, The Windup Girl by Paulo Bacigalupi. In summary, I loved it. Thailand, specifically Bangkok, is the setting for this book, The Windup Girl. We're in the 23rd century and the world is in a mess. There have been droughts, wars, flooding, all a result of climate change. Bangkok is now well below sea level, kept dry by a series of dams and levees and pumping stations. And global agriculture these days, such as it is dominated by a small number of so-called calorie companies, the evil megacorps of this changed world, controlling food production through gene-hacked seeds. And they're not afraid to use bioterrorism, private armies and economic hitmen to create markets for their products if needed. Fossil fuel is long in the past. Combustion engines are extremely rare, the preserve of the ultra-wealthy or the ultra-powerful. Power to the masses is provided by animal labour. In Bangkok, that is mostly in the form of the giant megadont, a kind of mammoth elephant mashup with additional megafauna DNA. And then there are these things called kink springs, which store power and are used to drive all sorts of domestic appliances. Thailand is alone in the world, it seems, in not relying on the calorie companies, preferring to rely on heritage seed stock that they've carefully husbanded over the decades, and being constantly vigilant for the spread of disease, and taking prompt and draconian action if it's found. I really love the world building in this book. It's lush and vivid without being in the foreground. Lots of detail is given in the incidentals in passing as you read the text. There have been cycles of expansion and contraction. Plagues and war and religious fundamentalism have killed millions upon millions and have driven waves of extreme migration. Anderson Lake is working undercover in Bangkok for Agrogen, one of the hated calorie companies. Visiting a sex club, as you do in Bangkok, he meets Amiko, a so-called wind-up, a hichi-kichi as the locals call them. Developed in Japan due to dramatically declining population, the wind-ups, or new people, are accepted in Japan but highly illegal in Thailand. Amiko is reduced to a sex slave, doing degrading things, but her conditioning and design means that she wants, needs and enjoys it. But her conditioning and design hide certain other, let's call them, capabilities. Lake becomes obsessed with Amiko and their fates become entwined. Like I say, I loved being in this world and I enjoyed the cut and thrust of the plot. There are numerous competing factions in Thailand, plus there's the migrants, the yellow cards, so-called, and then there's the Farang, the barely tolerated and mistrusted Westerners. I loved Amiko as a character, and as I said, she comes into her own, let's say, as the book develops. I really recommend it. If you haven't read it, it's definitely worth picking up. It's very, very good. So that, for me, was a pretty good reading week. How have you got on? Is there anything that you particularly want to highlight or recommend or let us know about? Do let me know in the comments down below. It's always a joy to hear from you. So briefly then, channel stuff next. Subs are at 4,423, which is up 118 on last week, which is a pretty good week. If you're one of those 118, or if you've just stumbled across my channel for the first time today, a huge welcome to you. I'm John, and I focus on reading, collecting, and talking nonsense about science fiction books, old and new. Comment of the week this week is from John Gallagher, who's new to reading and collecting science fiction books and was looking for tips and strategies for deciding which to buy. And boy, John, did you ask the wrong guy. I described the journey I've been on this last couple of years, becoming a little, but not a lot, more discerning in my book buying in the process. And my parting remark, of course, was to say that BookTube is a great source of recommendations for books that he might want to track down. Thank you to John for taking the time to leave a comment, and for the rest of you that did the same, as always, I really appreciate it. Let's take a quick look at what was on the channel this week. On Sunday, there was a look ahead to some new science fiction books due out this year, many of which I imagine will feature on the Goodreads poll at the end of the year. There were 2 or 3 that I liked the sound of, 2 or 3 that I already knew about and was actively wanted to read this year. And then on Tuesday, there was January's book haul. There are some really nice books in that haul. So if you haven't watched either of those, then I commend them both to you. They're definitely worth your time, I think. On the book buying front, actually, while we're on that subject, I was in London last weekend, so I naturally enough popped into a couple of bookshops whilst I was there. I found a Mark Laidlaw book in a secondhand bookshop. It's an author that I'd never really heard of before, but he had a short story in Mirror Shades, the Bruce Sterling anthology that I really enjoyed. And then I bought a couple of new books from Forbidden Planet, and a couple of things have arrived in the post, and more are on their way. My to-be hauled pile now sits at 17 books. Just taking a quick look ahead, on Sunday there will be a themed video looking at science fiction books set in wintry settings. It's actually warmed up a little bit here, it's a bit milder now, but last week when I was busy recording this, it was really cold here in the south of the UK. I mean, about time, it's the middle of winter and it's been really mild so far, but it was really chilly last week. We had temperatures well under freezing, and so it seemed an appropriate time to record that video. So there's 10 great books, all with a wintry setting of one kind or another. Some of them on Earth and some of them really not. Then on Tuesday, I think we'll take a closer look at this science fiction art book, which is focused on the 1970s. And I really like the look of this one, so I'll give you a quick spin through that. Longer range, I think I now have a complete collection of Adam Roberts science fiction novels. So we'll take a look at those, plus there'll be the usual TBR selection video for February and then the January recap. Video-wise, my main focus over the next couple of weeks will be the long-discussed 100 Years of Space Opera video. I'm anticipating that being quite a long, something to be dipped in and out of, perhaps. To some extent, it will be something like a greatest hits video. I'll be rehashing some content from the various space opera videos that I've done over the last 18 months or so, updating it and hopefully making a better job of presenting it too. I also had a brainwave the other day, a video perhaps on the best opening lines in science fiction, and many of you have suggested great opening lines, and I think I'm going to have fun making that video. And those last ones will appear at various points over the next 2 or 3 weeks, I think. So what will I be reading in the coming week? I've got the final part of the Waystation trilogy to finish, Those Who Resist, I think it's called, and I'll probably blast through that this weekend whilst I'm out on the trails. There's not a lot of it left. And then continuing on audiobook, I'm actually not sure what I'll pick next. It might be one of Ian Banks's non-culture SF books, or perhaps the next book in the Revelations space series. I'll toss a coin Either of them would be a reread for me, but I do want to get to them at some point this year. In actual book form, I'm a couple of chapters into The Separation by Christopher Priest, which is already turning out to be an alternate history in which the Second World War finished in May 1941. I don't think that that's the main thrust of the book. I think that's merely the background music, but it's very early days. I'll let you know about that next week. I've sort of melted back into Christopher Priest's prose, and I don't think and it's very direct and clear. I don't think it will be a difficult read at all. I think I'll finish that pretty fast. And after that, I'll have a crack at The Sparrow, which would leave, I think, 3 books left on my planned TBR pile for this month, one of which I should be able to make a start on at least during the coming week. So I think I'm in good shape for finishing what I expected to read. As always, thank you ever so much for watching. Have a wonderful weekend, and until next time, goodbye.